Good evening. We're going to get started. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Jim Thornton, Chair of the Board here at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you tonight as we celebrate the opening of a movement in every direction, Legacies of the Great Migration. Before I continue with my prepared comments, let me, if I may, just digress for a moment and just share why this exhibition is very personal for me. As many of you know, I grew up in the South. My wife, Lorraine, and I are from Alabama. She's from Montgomery, and I'm from the southeast part of the state, and we grew up in the 60s. And so we can really relate to the migration from the deep South or from the South to whether it be the Northeast or to the Midwest or to the West. So that makes the exhibition very special because I can personally relate to those 6 million, or many of those 6 millions, that made that same decision to leave the South and move to other parts of the country. It's also very personal because this is my first opportunity as the chair of the board to welcome all of you for an exhibition. And so I'm very excited for the opportunity. And before I continue my remarks, I'd like to acknowledge our immediate past chair that really, on her watch, this exhibition was clearly, along with Chris Bedford, our former executive director. So why don't we give Claire's in the audience tonight. Give Claire a round of applause. We're so thrilled to share this exhibition with you. And I know we'll all enjoy hearing from the BMA's Curator and Department Head for Contemporary Art and curator of this exhibition, Jessica Bell Brown. But before we get started, there are a few thank yous. We would not be able to present an exhibition like this if it wasn't for the exceptional generosity of this collection of foundations, individuals, and organizations. Our gratitude goes to our national sponsors, the Ford Foundation, the Henry Luce Foundation, Tigger Foundation, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, Bloomberg Philanthropies, the National Endowment for the Arts. On a local here in Baltimore, to make the exhibition possible, we'd like to acknowledge Agnes Gunn, Transamerica, BGE, the Robert Lehman Foundation, John Meyerhoff and Linnell Meyerhoff. And I should digress again, as I indicated earlier, all of our trustees are always advocating for exhibitions and really the work of the museum in general. But I wanted to particularly acknowledge John and Linnell. I was having a conversation with them last week over another event we were here, and they were really telling me how they've been champion to everybody they could talk to say, you got to come and see this great exhibition. So I wanted to just acknowledge John and Linnell and thank really all of our trustees that have continued to be supporters and encouraging others to take advantage of not only this exhibition, but hopefully exhibitions to come. Additional gratitude for the ongoing support of the Alvin and Fannie B. Thalheimer Exhibition Endowment Fund and the Suzanne F. Coyne Exhibition Fund. And finally, but not less essentially, I would like to thank all of you here tonight. As council members, you provide critical operational support that allows the BMA to employ the incredible team that makes exhibitions like this happen. It is these people who care for the collections, install the work, write the labels, greet you at the door, draw new audience, keep the building clean and safe for visitors. I could go on and on. Let me just say we're very grateful to all of you for your generous support. It is now my pleasure to introduce Christine Dietz, Interim Co-Director and Chief Operating Officer of the Baltimore Museum of Art. And enjoy the show. Chris?
Thank you, Jim. And let me reiterate Jim's thanks to all of you for being here to celebrate with us tonight. A movement in every direction offers an opportunity to reconsider the history of the Great Migration and tell a more multifaceted and nuanced narrative through the voices and work of some of the most influential artists of our time. This is also a particularly meaningful project for Baltimore, which was and continues to be shaped by this critical migration of people. This exhibition has been many years in the making, as Jim said, involving extensive collaboration between the BMA and our co-organizers, the Mississippi Museum of Art. My interim co-director, Asma Naeem, and I want to thank Betsy Bradley, director of the Mississippi Museum of Art, and Ryan Dennis, chief curator and artistic director of the Center for Art and Public Exchange at MMA, for partnering with us on this incredible journey. Along with Ryan, this exhibition was curated by our own Jessica Bell Brown, Curator and Department Head for Contemporary Art. We are so very grateful for her hard work and for her unwavering dedication to this ambitious project. I also want to echo what Jim said earlier about the impact made by all of the BMA colleagues who played an integral role in making this exhibition happen, many of whom are here with us tonight, and I would like to just take a moment and ask them to wave or stand and be recognized. Staff, BMA colleagues, come on. I know you will appreciate all the efforts of my colleagues when you make your way through this extraordinary exhibition, which will be open directly after our remarks. There will also be a reception in Antioch Court, so we hope you stay for some cocktails, conversation, and hors d'oeuvres until 8 p.m. when the gallery opens to members. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce the BMA's Curator and Department Head for Contemporary Art, Jessica Bell Brown.
Good evening. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jim, for your wonderful comments. And I just want to thank all of you here tonight as we celebrate the opening of a movement in every direction, Legacies of the Great Migration. I also want to thank my co-curator, Ryan Dennis, who could not be here this evening. She is preparing to bring new life into the world, so I'm so excited for her. This exhibition is a true labor of love, and it brings together 12 artists who, over the course of the last 2 years, have explored their family connections to the Great Migration and produced new works from painting, sculpture, film, and video installation, drawing, photography, and more. But before I begin, I too want to extend my gratitude to all of the artists and our colleagues across the BMA and the MMA whose efforts have resulted in this magnificent and historic show. Tonight's talk will be informed from an essay that Ryan and I co-authored called Destinations, Returns, and Legacy, Expanding Portals for New Movement, which weaves through the historical and contemporary groundings of the exhibition works. I encourage you to take a deeper dive into the research and artist projects, which you can find in the not one but two exhibition catalogs for the show, the first of which are A Movement in Every Direction, A Great Migration Critical Reader, published by Yale University Press, is available now for purchase at the BMA store and online. So I thought I would share with you some of the underpinnings of the artist projects that you will encounter in the exhibition, if that's okay. And I want to start with Frank Boyer, who was the son of a farmer and a migrant from Augusta, Georgia, who founded a small black colony in 1898 called Blackdom on the heels of the Great Exodus. The Great Exodus was a period after emancipation where newly freedmen were leaving the South for the plains and what would eventually become known as the American West. Blackdom was the first black town in New Mexico territory, and this presages the moment when New Mexico entered into statehood in 1912. There are many historical circumstances that accelerated the path toward the Great Migration. Under the 1862 Homestead Act, supported by President Abraham Lincoln, American citizens over 21 years of age could apply for free federal land, and coupled with the newly established mobility of formerly enslaved persons after the Civil War, the Exoduster movement, or the Great Exodus, was in many ways a precursor to the Great Migration and is arguably one of the reasons that Black townships, like Blackdom, formed in the latter part of the 19th century. Beginning in 1877, it was one of the first grassroots movements of the South in which 40 to 70,000 African Americans departed the South for Kansas. For many Southerners, Kansas's offerings were bountiful and folks could exercise their rights as free citizens, gain political power, and over time develop economic independence and self-sufficiency. And this movement from Kansas also shifted to Arkansas, Missouri, westward, even to places like New Mexico. These were Black Western frontiersmen, settlers. These were self-starters, dreamers, and destiny seekers. They built homes, they built schools, they had a post office, and access to a well amidst the harsh Western landscape. See it right here, David Prophet's wooden house in Blackdom, New Mexico. For artist Mark Bradford, Blackdom drew connection to his own background of self-starters, merchants, and strivers within underground economies. He found an advertisement for it in the 1913 issue of the Crisis magazine, at left, the publishing arm for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Wanted, the ad said, 500 Negro families, farmers preferred, to settle on free government lands in Chaves County, New Mexico. Blackdom is a Negro colony, fertile soil, ideal climate, no Jim Crow laws. For information, write Jas Howard Coleman, Blackdom, New Mexico. Can you even imagine? So comprising a grid of 60 panels, Bradford's monumental mixed media painting, 500, repeats this ad over and over again, 60 times, using caulked and oxidized panels, connecting it to an ethos of resilience and promise that resonates with the strength and persistence that allowed Bradford's great-grandmother and mother to open businesses that sustained them, their families, and their communities, from Pennsylvania to Los Angeles. So I've shared with you an example of one way in which the 12 artists in our exhibition have inhabited a singular prompt. How do we talk about the Great Migration in ways that are expansive and nuanced? And how does the Great Migration show up in one's sort of family narrative or family stories? So I'll kind of weave in and out of these projects to offer you some framing thoughts for when you enter the exhibition in a few more moments. Torkwase Dyson, too, explores the conditions that have impacted the forceful and forced movements of Black populations, from the plantation system to the spatial and social limitations of boundaries of Jim Crow and the impacts of climate change and policies of resource extraction. A union of Dyson's practices of drawing, architecture, and abstraction, Way Over There Inside of Me, A Festival of Inches, draws on personal experiences such as her youth in Chicago as the child of two Mississippi-born parents, and her student years at Tougaloo College, which is a HBCU, a historically Black college in Tougaloo, Mississippi, outside of Jackson. Her movement between these places and what she describes as the accelerating force of Black movement in America inform her understanding of the intentional and coincidental migrations that shape Black life in this country. So, how are we to account for the power and magnitude of this acceleration that occurred when 6 million African Americans left the South to go to the Northeast, to the Midwest, to the Southwest, the West Coast, and even within small towns and rural centers and urban centers in the southeastern region? How can we capture the acceleration of demographic, cultural, social, ecological changes as a result of this migration? Sometimes a metaphor or perhaps an equation rooted in architecture is necessary. In this monumental sculpture, Dyson alludes to the forces that shape the dwindling presence of free Black unincorporated towns across this country, where oil drilling and chemical manufacturing have caused longtime residents to cede their land to corporations, resulting in groundwater contamination and subsequent displacement. Made of industrial strength tempered black glass and steel, and brought together into 4 trapezoidal shapes that almost kind of echo cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. This work approximates the feelings of displacement and possibility, its openings, passages reflecting both transparency and opacity. Like these portals, Dyson emphasizes that discussions of Black narrative must remain open. We must, quote, always have a way out, end quote. Thus, she strategically leans on perspective in her sculpture, through which play with light, volume, distance, and legibility make us cognizant of our bodies and their surroundings. Ultimately, this disruption of our sense of space and embodied presence leads us back to the power of the present moment that changes the course of history and allows us to reclaim our futures. In one of the earliest conversations that Ryan and I, my co-curator, my beloved partner in imagination, we had an early conversation with Carrie Mae Weems in which she shared that in 1937, Dorothea Lange had photographed her then uncle, Clarence Weems, who we see here pictured at the left. Wait, right. Lange photographed him during her work for the WPA on the Delta Farm Cooperative, which included sharecroppers and tenant farmers in Hill House, Mississippi. Her uncle Clarence, a child at this time, had been rendered effectively a refugee. Her grandfather, Frank Weems, Clarence's father, was attacked in Earle, Arkansas by a vicious mob on June 9, 1936, for establishing a cross-racial coalition of unionized tenant farmers, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, an image of which is pictured at left. The white landowners and politicians were not pleased about Weems's activity, and a mob ensued. He was nearly beaten to death, and he disappeared. A funeral was even planned. Ida B. Wells Barnett's groundbreaking anti-lynching activism in many ways established an early frame for the Great Migration, this country's largest demographic shift of the 20th century. Her landmark, The Red Record, tabulated statistics and alleged causes of lynching in the United States from 1895, assessed the hundreds of lynchings and extrajudicial murders of African American men, women, and children during the years 1892 to 1894, making clear the circumstances that often necessitated migration, including the immediate consequences of emancipation and the right of franchise brought about by the 15th Amendment, which offered a fledgling possibility of political power for African Americans, and in particular African American men. Her journalism showed the systematic oppression advanced by whites on Black Americans and the ways in which Black Americans had little to no protection under the rule of law, and how the prescribed social order, racial hierarchy, affirmed the reality of imminent brutality, death, or subjugation of Black people. And this is exactly what Frank Weems was facing in his organizing efforts down south that ultimately led to this tragic incident. Yet, as a June 1927 article in the Chicago Defender noted, even the combination of Southern legal action and intimidation had not stymied Black migrants, who were increasingly packing up their hopes and dreams and setting out for far-flung cities across the country. Memphis and St. Louis have reported a steady stream of migrants from points in Mississippi and Alabama, all headed for north. For once in their lives, the travelers seem determined to fight the South and lynchings with the only weapon these people can understand. There is no doubt of the importance of laborers to the South, where white people deem it a disgrace to be seen working, and this exodus, it is feared, will bring about the complete new order of things, end quote. It was not until months later, in 1937, that Frank Weems had reemerged in Chicago. He had survived. We see on my right, the Herald Review article in which Frank Weems appears with his Workers' Defense League attorney, Francis Heisler. Apparently, after the attack, he had hidden until nightfall, and led by the North Star, he made his way to Chicago, where he was never reunited with his family. A political enemy to the state of Arkansas, he lived the rest of his life in hiding for fear of retribution. Weems's projects, the North Star, and Leave Now, this is the North Star at screen now, inhabit the interstices of her grandfather's story, considering the ever-evolving symbolic, literal, and metaphorical charge of his disappearance, a defining force that has shaped outcomes for generations in her family, in the Weems family. One of the major premises of our show is that every person arguably has a migration story, whether one's ancestors fled or chose to remain rooted where they were. I wanted to show you just a still of the image of Carrie May's installation, Leave Now, which is a 5-part film that unpacks the reverberating effects of Frank Weems's absence in his family across generations. It's absolutely gut-wrenching, and I encourage you to spend a lot of time in it. So as we embarked on our research, we began to unpack a central through line in our show, which is the continued importance of one's connection to land and the power and agency located in how we cultivate our gardens wherever we might reside. So how can stories of terror and injustice also hold space for abundance and plenitude and nuance and complexity? Alice and Janae Hamilton's maternal and paternal ancestors found their strength and agency by staying in the South. Her great-great-grandfather bought a farm in Carroll County, Tennessee in the 30s, and they made money from cash crops like cotton and soybeans and livestock. Many of her grandmother's siblings decided to move to Flint, Michigan during the automotive boom, a second migration. But her grandmother stayed, living on the land that has remained in their family for nearly a century. Hamilton was born in Kentucky, and her family moved to North Florida when she was a young child. So an ode to Black Floridians who remained in the South, a house called Florida, of which you see stills on the screen now, images of the work in progress, shot down in Florida in the Apalachicola region, which is swampy North Florida marshland. She was interested in referencing her upbringing and her connection to the land and her ongoing environmental and climate concerns, collaging this film with performance scenes and breathtaking footage of the Apalachicola region. She beautifully represents the mystical and personal questions of land loss, inspired by Julio Cortázar's short story, House Taken Over, or Casa Tomada. A House Called Florida is a meditation on a haunting, a questioning of what the land of North Florida and other parts of the South would look like if so many individuals had not been forced to migrate elsewhere. The film also honors those who stayed and foregrounds a poetic display of Southern music, culture, spirituality, and expression. So this interest in ecology and natural disaster is also tied to Jamia Richmond Edwards' history and family. I'll kind of slide through. Forgive me, I'm a little delayed on my clicker. So in 1927, there was the Great Mississippi River flood. Jamia's family owned land there in Mississippi, but they were displaced along with thousands of other Black Mississippians after the flood and experienced further devastation after the East St. Louis tornado later that year, as her family had moved further and further away from Mississippi towards westward towards the other side of the Mississippi River. They decided to move north and relocated to Detroit to explore blue-collar opportunities. You're seeing at the screen here an image of the aftermath of that flood in Mississippi. So for her piece, This Water Runs Deep, Richmond Edwards' largest work to date, she featured vibrantly collaged painted imagery showing her immediate family moving by boat, surrounded by turbulent waters and a serpent. This is a metaphor for their survival during hard times, decade by decade in the North, where they believed they would find auspicious opportunities for economic growth, but encountered challenges at least equal in measure. This Water Runs Deep is a celebration of Black resilience and futurity in the face of tragedy and displacement and natural disaster. The long array of systemic challenges like social segregation, racism, and discrimination that Black communities of freedmen and migrants faced from the Reconstruction era right up to the present moment were still ever present and multivalent. Migration meant for many, as new arrivals, finding and building communities from the ground up. Networks of care, support, and infrastructure for Black migrants who often faced obstacles and challenges in their process of starting over in new cities is somewhat the subject of A Song for Travelers, which I'll show you in a few moments. Looking to his own personal archive, having conversations with elders, and collecting found photography and magazines of the past, Robert Pruitt explores his relatives' connections to the resources and communities that directly surrounded them in Houston. Between the years of 1914 and 1945, approximately 44,000 Black women, children, and men, Pruitt's family amongst them, moved to the city of Houston, principally from eastern Texas and southern Louisiana. Returning to Black space-making informs his newest large-scale figurative drawing, A Song for Travelers, which is informed by these sort of networks of care and support and community, and the sort of infrastructure building that necessitated sustaining thriving Black communities, both in southern cities like Houston and in places like Chicago and beyond. Houston's 4th Ward, also known as Freedmen's Town, was an epicenter for Black life during the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. Along with the 3rd Ward, another important Black neighborhood, which has defined Pruitt's understanding of the Great Migration as a process of community building. His relatives did not look elsewhere for economic opportunities. They were active participants in the building of the neighborhood infrastructure. So A Song for Travelers presents 17 figures that shape the exploration of historical moments, from the 1917 Camp Logan riot to the formation of microcosms of culture that they developed: schools, social clubs, and entertainment and religious connections. And I'll go back to the previous slide so that you can get a sense of the kind of fullness of the archival groundings of this incredible work. This work guides us from the past to the present and takes us to new futures that include a legacy of plenitude that emerged from generational investment in community that even predates the Great Migration, but was indeed strengthened by it. In a December 27, 1918 article of the Afro-American entitled A Review of the Year 1918, I'll skip ahead to it, we look back at a moment in which we see two intertwined phenomena in American history: the industrialization of American cities vis-a-vis the war, World War I, and as economic opportunity for new migrants who filled and labored in factories, warehouses, railroads, and ships. Nearly 386,000 African-American soldiers are catapulted into the world to fight World War I in Europe. Quote, "In the field of industry, the war has given the colored man his chance, and the colored man has made good in many striking cases. The migrants were coming. This economic and militaristic boon would happen episodically again against the backdrop of World War II and stretch across the 6 decades of the Great Migration from Vietnam, Korea, and beyond." So the experiences of Black military families during World War I, II, and beyond are not often taken into consideration when thinking about the wider context of the Great Migration, but they are central to Zoe Charlton's permanent change of station. In this work, Zoe explores her family, who hails from the Florida Panhandle, and several relatives who found the defense industry to be an aspirational space of possibility and community. Charlton questions the complexities and tensions between generations that this is presented in a large-scale drawing and installation that depict life abroad and at her grandmother's home in Florida. Kind of fast forward to her grandmother's home. That's her family home in Florida, helmed by the matriarch Everlina Bates. The composition includes Southeast Asian rice terraces and the segregated Levittown, Pennsylvania subdivision, making the familiar domestic spaces unfamiliar places. Within permanent change of station, an African-American woman has her back towards the viewer, surveying the land with a toy U.S. Air Force McDonnell F-4C-23 Phantom II cargo plane in her right hand, and she's priming it for the release straight into Levittown, perhaps signaling a wish to implode the imperialistic ambitions of the military-industrial complex. Charlton seizes duality to mirror the condition of humankind, which grapples with contradictions on the path to benefit, define, and at times uplift greater community. So, what are the known and unknown sacrifices someone in your lineage had to make to afford you the opportunity that you have today? I think about Jacob Lawrence's migration series from the years 1940 to 1941, and in particular, panel 57. The female workers were the last to arrive north. Black women were often the last migrants left behind. And so this sort of next phase of the talk is about those kinds of sacrifices Black women often found themselves in during this Great Migration period. I'm also thinking about a letter sent to the Chicago Defender in April 1917 from Corinth, Mississippi. Dear sir, I'm ready to come out just as soon as you send the passes to us. I want to bring a box of quilts and a trunk of clothes, so you please send us the passes for me and my daughter. Write me at once. I am a Negro woman. We will leave here Saturday if you send the passes. Akia Breon looks to the lives of sacrifices of her great-grandmother and great-aunts, the Phelps sisters, to understand their path of sacrifice. Akia's family is from Mississippi, Louisiana, and New Mexico. Obtaining a trove of family photos, she became almost this sort of ancestral archivist. An ode to you all weaves together 6 photo collages on jacquard tapestries that reflect self-portraits informed by conversations with her grandfather, journeying through her familial land in Columbus, and the selflessness of the Phelps sisters. So together, these women created opportunities for the men in their family to head north while they remained behind, building schoolhouses, creating educational possibilities for community and youth, and offering a tender and loving environment for the family, a place of grounding. Stephanie Jemison's Array presents migration as a space of dreaming, a world of conjuring and manifestation, even in the present moment. Like an incantation, you know New York, you need New York, you know you need unique New York, which is repeated by the film star, Lakia Black, a nursing student, a former nursing student, and native of Uniontown, Alabama, who moonlights as a TikTok performer, as we see scenes that are collaged together, cars sort of traveling, roving landscape, but and performance as well. We witness Lakia inhale, exhale, and rehearse this incantation and other tongue twisters as if preparing for a performance. So through the lip-synced footage of her inhabiting these stories, personalities, and likenesses of others, we come to understand the film as an abstract investigation of transformation and possibility that pressures the concept of migration as geographic movement and excavates its inherent connection to the space of imagination and manifestation. In Lakia's shape-shifting performance, we can see a desire to transcend and expand that fundamentally that desire that fundamentally connects the hopes and dreams of Southern ancestors who also grappled with such choices. I'm also thinking about how are we to sort of understand the memories of places not shaped by direct experience, but rather the subtle connections, oral histories, and inheritances that are left behind. For Leslie Hewitt, abstraction is a capacious strategy to grapple with the pieces of generational stories passed down to her that might not necessarily connect to a whole. Hewitt's contribution to this exhibition examines her family's ties to Macon, Georgia, which is a place where she had not yet traveled, but nevertheless holds great significance to her family's migration story. Intricately carved wooden shapes, meticulously designed steel I-beams, and glass heirlooms, vessels from the artist's grandmother, come together in an intervention within the exhibition. In 3 works, I'll show the first of here, Untitled Slow Drag, Barely Moving Imperceptible, Untitled Barely Moving Imperceptible Slow Drag, and Untitled Imperceptible Slow Drag and Barely Moving, all created in 2022. Hewitt employs these significant materials that point to Black craftsmanship of her grandfather, who was an upholsterer and a craftsman, not unlike Thomas Day, who is a really important Black cabinet maker and furniture maker dating back to the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century. And we see it left here, or right here, his curved newel post at the Bartlett Yancey House in North Carolina, dated to 1820. Bartlett Yancey was a politician, a famous politician in North Carolina. And at left here, we see an image of the Ruth Hartley Mosley House and Women's Center in Macon, Georgia, which is where I'm from. And it's a historic home that I spent a lot of time in as a child growing up, and likely saw a number of vessels like those that we see in Leslie's sculpture. So in thinking about domestic space and inheritance, if we look closely, we see that Hewitt leaves a trace of something much bigger than she's attempting to unpack, namely the ways in which place and migration are frequently as much imagined as they are real. This speculative approach compels us to recognize that sometimes the archive is not the starting point for tracing one's family and one's history, and that gaps in knowledge and absences can be filled with specificity and abstraction. Larry Cook leads us beyond the individual on his communal journey of meditation and healing. Time spent exploring his family's roots in Georgia and in the Carolinas resulted in the unexpected discovery that the historical absence of strong father figures in the home had impacted generations of the Cook paternal line. Cook has made portraits of Black men in previous works, and Black fathers in particular in previous works, but having a different set of resources available to him allowed him to take a more expansive approach for this exhibition in terms of creating a new mode of picture making. Let My Testimony Sit Next to Yours is a series of 5 large-scale landscape photographs accompanied by a portrait of Cook's father and archival photos of the Cook men, which spans 5 generations. Unfortunate circumstances between the Cook's great-great-great-grandfather, Jim Cook Jr., and his wife, Minnie Pearson Cook, in the 1920s sort of created a break in the family that continued to affect future generations. Cook gives us a window to see the entanglements of enduring love and dispossession, while also encouraging us to share stories within our families that could lead to healing and truth-seeking for future generations. While Cook had traveled down south, he would often stop at places where his family may have traversed and meditated on the sort of heaviness and expansiveness of his family history, and this, in particular, the cook men in the family. So you'll see in the exhibition a suite of landscape photographs coupled with archival photographs from his family and a portrait of Larry's father, which you saw just prior, at right or at left. I have no sense of direction. So to bring us home, I want to talk about the Astor Gates Jr., who uses distinct memories of his uncle's farm and double-wide trailer in Humphreys County, Mississippi, as the conduit to imagine a place that was central to his formation when he spent many summers there as a child. On the farm, his uncle's trailer was a place for distribution and storage, a candy store by day and a juke joint by night. Gates emphasizes that to Southerners, land ownership, and by these principles shared with and instilled in him by his uncle, are fundamental to what he describes as a country logic of strong work ethic and self-sufficiency. The components of the double wide, which include decommissioned pine wood from the Park Avenue Armory floor and fragments and ornamentation from a Louis Sullivan building in Chicago, amalgamate a migration experience. Inside the trailer rooms, Gates has lined the shelves with an assortment of Mississippi jams made by his cousin Charlene, and pickled vegetables and meats from Miss T's Sweets and Treats in Silver City, Mississippi. Gathering up a harvest grown in one's own backyard, and the communal and meditative practice of saving and preserving the bounty to be savored for later. He points to the possibility of finding God, too, in everything. A figure of the Black Madonna and Child, which you see here, is hitched to the trailer rooms and leads all the forms in the procession. Taken from an old keychain that accompanied Gates on his journeys from north to south over the years, Mary has been enlarged, cast in bronze, and leads the trailer as a means of protection and anchoring in God. Moreover, for Gates, call and response, this incredible sonic and spiritual tradition, is explicitly a black creative form that penetrates the double wide through sets of juxtapositions, old and new, secular and spiritual, nourishment and excess. In two videos that accompany the work, archival family footage of recitals, gatherings, reunions are fortified by the additional musical accompaniment of Gates's improvisational gospel group, the Black Monks. It resounds in the embodied experience of the installation. Call and response reigns as the perfect metaphor to underscore migration as a set of dynamic energies, relationships, and spaces that are in continuous dialogue. Ryan and I hope that these complex and inspiring works of art will cultivate a broad set of experiences for you as you see this show, and we hope that the histories exhumed in this exhibition through personal through personal histories and those specific to the artists will compel us to take in the power and the legacies of our connections to spaces and places near and far. We would love for you for this show to be a forum that honors the paths of our ancestors collectively and the decisions and sacrifices that they have made and hopes and dreams that they've pursued, along with brighter tomorrows that they imagine for themselves and for their loved ones. For without their immense faith, the futures that we have enjoyed would not have been possible. Thank you.